The signal was already wrong before I understood what wrong meant. I was sitting in the cab of a parked FEMA communications truck on the shoulder of Route 9 outside Killeen, Texas, running scheduled diagnostic checks on relay equipment I'd been maintaining for 11 days, when the emergency broadcast system did something I'd never heard it do in 6 years of federal communications work. It repeated itself, not the message. The carrier tone. The tone that precedes every EBS activation is a specific dual-frequency burst at 853 and 960 Hz, lasting exactly 8 seconds. What came through my headset at 6:14 that morning lasted 19 seconds and included a third frequency I couldn't identify. I logged it, flagged it, and sent the anomaly report to the regional coordinator in San Antonio. The auto-reply told me her inbox was full. My name is Dara Lasco. I was a GS-9 telecommunications specialist for FEMA Region 6, assigned to maintain the relay infrastructure between Fort Cavazos, what most people still called Fort Hood, and the Regional Emergency Coordination Center. My job was not interesting. My job was driving between signal towers in a government truck, running diagnostic software, replacing corroded grounding cables, and filing reports that nobody downstream seemed to read. I was good at it. I understood the equipment the way a plumber understands pipe. Not theoretically, but physically, through the feeling of a connector that's seated wrong or the smell of a transformer running too hot. I had no authority. I had no weapon. I had a government ID that opened certain gates and a maintenance schedule that had told me where to be on any given Tuesday. That third frequency kept nagging me. I ran spectral analysis on the recording during my lunch break, parked under a cell tower south of Harker Heights. The third tone sat at 1,450 Hz, right in the range where human attention peaks. That wasn't accidental. Someone had modified the broadcast header, and the modification was designed to make you listen, whether you wanted to or not. I called Marcus Reed, my counterpart covering the Austin to Waco corridor, because Marcus had 19 years in military communications before crossing to civilian federal service. And if anyone would recognize a non-standard broadcast protocol, it was him. Marcus didn't answer. His truck's GPS transponder showed him stationary at a rest stop north of Temple. That wasn't unusual. Marcus took long lunches. But when I pulled his maintenance log, his last entry was from the previous afternoon. 17 hours without a log entry from a man who filed them religiously. I finished my sandwich. I drove to his location. The rest stop parking lot held 4 vehicles, including Marcus's truck. His cab was empty and locked. No signs of disturbance. I used my spare key. We'd exchanged copies years ago for exactly this kind of situation, and found his headset on the passenger seat, still connected, still receiving. The anomalous broadcast was cycling. The triple frequency header repeated every 90 seconds, followed by a standard EBS message about shelter-in-place orders for Bell County that I'd been hearing for a week. But between each cycle, there was something else, a compressed data burst, lasting less than a second, buried under the shelter-in-place audio. I almost missed it. Anyone not running spectral analysis would have missed it. The burst was a coordinate set and a timestamp, repeating. The coordinates pointed to the western perimeter of Fort Cavazos, specifically to a gate I'd driven through dozens of times. The timestamp was 6 hours from now. My phone showed 11 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, texts from my sister in Ohio, 3 blue question marks, and then call me right now. I tried to call her. The network returned a fast, busy signal I hadn't heard since the ice storms 2 years ago. I tried the landline relay through the FEMA truck's communications suite. The relay was operational, but every trunk line heading north was saturated. I sat in Marcus's truck for several minutes, running the spectral analysis again, confirming what I already knew. Someone inside the military broadcast infrastructure was embedding tactical coordinates inside civilian emergency broadcasts. They were using the civilian system as a delivery mechanism because the military channels were either compromised or shut down, and they had modified the header frequency to ensure that anyone monitoring, anyone with the equipment and training to hear the difference, would stop and pay attention. I was that anyone. That was the entire problem. I drove toward the coordinates because driving toward the coordinates was my job, not the embedded signal part. Nobody had briefed me on covert data bursts or modified EBS headers, but the location was Gate 7 on Fort Cavazos' western boundary, and Gate 7 was on my maintenance route. Vanished. Why every phone line heading north was saturated, or why the civilian broadcast system was being used as a covert military channel. The rational move was to report the anomaly and wait for instructions, but reporting required reaching someone, and I couldn't reach anyone. The drive from the rest stop to Gate 7 was 22 minutes through terrain I knew as well as my own kitchen. Central Texas in late spring. Flat scrubland going gold at the edges. Live oaks along the creek beds. The post's fence line running parallel to the road like a ruled line on paper. I'd driven this road in every weather, every light condition, every season. I knew where the pavement buckled, where the drainage culvert flooded in heavy rain, where the cell signal dropped for a quarter mile near the old quarry. What I didn't know, until I came around the curve past the quarry, was what several hundred people looked like, walking through a field in the same direction. They were 400 meters from the road, moving southeast through knee-high grass. From that distance, they looked like a crowd leaving a stadium. Same general heading. No visible organization, no vehicles. But nobody leaves a stadium into open scrubland in Bell County. There was nothing southeast of that field except more field, then a creek, then fence line. I slowed the truck. Some of them were stumbling in ways that didn't match the terrain. The ground there was flat. One figure near the back of the group dropped to all fours and continued forward without breaking pace. I didn't stop. I want to be clear about that. I registered the image. I classified it as wrong. And I pressed the accelerator because the alternative was parking on a 2-lane road with no shoulder to study something my training had no category for. I was 2 miles from the gate. The broadcast was still cycling through my headset. The compressed data burst repeated its coordinate and timestamp like a patient, mechanical heartbeat. Gate 7 was open. Not unlocked. Open. The barrier arm was raised, the guard booth was empty, and the electronic access panel was dark. I'd serviced that panel 3 months ago. It ran on base power with a battery backup rated for 72 hours. For it to be dark, both systems had to have failed, or someone had deliberately cut it. I drove through because the gate was open and the coordinates pulled me forward, and because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. The western perimeter of Fort Cavazos is logistics territory. Warehouses, motor pools, equipment yards. It's the part of the post that exists to feed the operational parts. Unglamorous and sprawling, laid out in a grid that prioritizes truck access over aesthetics. I'd been through it hundreds of times, servicing communication infrastructure mounted on warehouse roofs and relay cabinets bolted to the sides of maintenance buildings. I knew the layout the way I knew the road. Physically, through repetition, not from maps. The base was not empty. But it was emptied. Vehicle bays stood open with vehicles still inside. Loading docks had pallets half-staged, forklifts parked with their forks still raised. A clipboard lay on the ground outside a supply building, with a pen still clipped to it. Whatever had happened here had happened mid-task, interrupting people in the middle of work and pulling them away fast enough that they hadn't closed doors or shut down equipment. A diesel generator was running behind one of the warehouses, feeding power into a building that appeared to have no one inside it. I followed the coordinates to a communications building I'd serviced twice before. A single-story concrete structure with a hardened antenna array on the roof. The door was propped open with a fire extinguisher. Inside, the lights were on. The air conditioning was running, and a woman in Army combat uniform was sitting at a console with her boots off, eating peanut butter from a jar with a plastic spoon. She looked at me with an expression of such profound unsurprise that I understood immediately. I was expected. You're the FEMA relay tech, she said. Not a question. Dara Lasco, Staff Sergeant Ava Kulquit. You found the burst. She gestured at an empty chair with a spoon. Sit down. I'll explain what you drove through to get here. And then you're going to help me figure out whether anyone else heard it. Kulquit had been communications guy at Fort Cavazos for 4 years, specializing in exactly the kind of broadcast infrastructure I maintained on the civilian side. She was the one who'd modified the EBS header. She'd embedded the coordinate burst. She'd done it 12 hours ago, alone, from this console, after the base evacuation order had pulled every unit east toward Austin, and she'd chosen not to go. Chose was her word. I pressed on it. Evacuation was mandatory, she said, screwing the cap back on the peanut butter jar with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every calorie now had weight. Everyone on post was directed to Convoy East. Dependents, civilian workers, all units not already deployed. I watched the convoy form from this roof. Took 2 hours. I was supposed to be in vehicle 40-something. Why weren't you? Because the convoy route passed through Temple, and Temple was already gone. She said it the way you'd say a road was flooded. A practical mass assessment, not an emotional one. Temple was a city of 80,000 people, 17 miles away. I'd driven through it 3 days ago. Kulquit pulled up satellite imagery on her console, time-stamped from the previous morning. The image showed the major intersections choked with vehicles in a pattern I recognized from disaster training. Convergent gridlock, every route in, no route out. But the spaces between the vehicles weren't empty. They were populated, densely, by figures that cast no vehicle shadows, because they weren't in vehicles. They were standing. Hundreds of them, in the roadways, between the cars, in the median, on the overpasses. The convoy rolled into that, I said. The convoy was given a route that went around it. Through the north side, I was monitoring their channel. She paused. The north side wasn't clear. It just hadn't been imaged yet. I sat with that. Kulquit let me sit with it. So you stayed. I stayed because this building has independent power, hardened communications, and a direct uplink to 3 satellite systems that the evacuation left active. Everything on this base that isn't nailed to a classified network is still operational. The motor pool is full. The warehouses are stocked. The perimeter fence is intact on 3 sides. The west gate is open because I opened it. For me. For anyone who could read the burst. You're the first. It's been 12 hours. I understood then what Kulquit had done and why she'd done it. The military evacuation had pulled every trained body east into a corridor that was already compromised. The base, this massive, sprawling, infrastructure-rich installation, had been abandoned in working order. Not destroyed, not stripped, not secured. Abandoned. Kulquit had recognized that an intact, powered, provisioned military base with functional communications was the most valuable piece of real estate in Central Texas, and she'd stayed to keep it alive. But she couldn't operate it alone. She needed people with technical skills, and the only way to find them without exposing the base's status on open channels was to hide signal inside a signal that only a technician would detect. How many people do you think can read that burst? I asked. In my career field, within range of this relay network, maybe 20. But most of them went with the convoy. She looked at me. On the civilian side, maintaining the same relay infrastructure, I had no idea. I hoped at least one. What she was describing wasn't a stronghold. It wasn't a fortress or a refuge. It was an unmanned industrial complex. A factory with no workers, an engine with no crew. Everything on the base functioned, but nothing on the base operated. Because operation required people, and the people were gone. The group I saw on the road, I said. In the field, heading southeast. Several hundred. Kulquit nodded. They started moving through yesterday evening. Not on the roads, through the fields, the creek beds, open ground. They follow each other. One goes, 10 follow, 10 becomes 100. The fence stops them on 3 sides. The west gate was my calculated risk. It's wide open. If I closed it, you couldn't have gotten in. And if I can't get people in, this place is a warehouse, not a position. She pushed the chair back and stood, shorter than I'd assumed, compact, with the kind of physical economy that suggested she never used effort she didn't need. I need to show you the roof. You need to see what we're working with. And then we need to decide. Together. Because I don't outrank you in any way that matters now. Whether we close that gate or leave it open for whoever else might be listening. The roof of the communications building was flat, ringed by a low parapet, and crowded with antenna arrays I couldn't have identified in my sleep. From up there, the western portion of Fort Cavazos spread out like a diagram of organized potential. Warehouses in rows, vehicle yards in grids, fuel points marked by their distinctive blast berms, everything connected by roads wide enough for the heaviest military transport. In the 6 years I'd maintained relay equipment across this post, I'd never stood in one place and seen so much of it at once. The scale was numbing. This wasn't a camp. It was a small, specialized city, and it was running on autopilot with a population of 2. Kulquit pointed south. Perimeter fence, 12 feet with concertina wire, intact from the south gate clockwise to the northwest corner. That's about 9 miles of continuous barrier. She shifted east. East side, same fence, running past the airfield and down to the main cantonment. Also intact, but the cantonment side has vehicle gates every quarter mile. And I don't know their status. She pointed north. North fence. Intact, but it crosses 2 creek beds where the ground dips below the barrier line. Heavy rain could erode the footings. We haven't had heavy rain. Then west. West fence, intact except for gate 7, which is standing open because I wanted you here. And the fields beyond it. Look. I looked. The field I'd driven past 40 minutes ago was empty now. The several hundred figures were gone. Not dispersed, gone. The grass wasn't even bent in any pattern I could see from this distance. They move through, Kulquit said. That's what I've observed. They don't camp, they don't mill, they don't establish. They're in transit, southeast, consistently. I've watched 3 groups in 2 days. Smallest was maybe 50. Largest was what you saw. They come from the northwest, they cross the fields, they hit the creek, and they follow it south. None of them have approached the fence. Because they're not interested in the base. Because they're following something I can't identify. Something southeast of here is pulling them. I don't know what. It might be sound. It might be another population center. It might be each other. But they're not random. They have a heading. This mattered enormously and immediately. Every survival scenario I'd been trained for. Flooding, tornado, infrastructure collapse. Assume that threats were either stationary, you avoid them, or chaotic, you shelter from them. What Kulquit was describing was directional. The infected were transiting through the area like weather moving along a front, and as long as you weren't in the path of that front, you weren't in immediate danger. But the front could shift. The path could change. The thing pulling them southeast could stop pulling. And several hundred bodies with no destination would become several hundred bodies with nothing to do except respond to whatever stimulus was closest. I need to understand the timeline, I said. When did the base evacuate? 41 hours ago. When did the infected start moving through the area? First group I observed was about 6 hours after the evacuation. Before that, I don't know. I was inside, setting up the broadcast. So it's possible they were already here before you opened the gate. It's possible they were already here before the evacuation. Nobody was looking at the fields. Everyone was looking at the convoy route. We went back downstairs. Kulquit had already begun something she called an operational inventory, a document on her console, listing every base asset she'd been able to confirm from the communications building's records and her own physical reconnaissance. The list was simultaneously overwhelming and useless, because having is not the same as operating, and everything on that list required someone to go to it, assess it, and make it work. The motor pool alone contained over 200 vehicles, most in maintenance status, but at least 40 listed as mission capable. The nearest warehouse held MRS, meals ready to eat, in quantities that could feed a small town for months. Fuel reserves across 3 separate fuel points exceeded 50,000 gallons of diesel. Medical supplies existed in a field clinic building adjacent to the motor pool. Communications equipment obviously was Kulquit's domain and already operational. What wasn't on the list was anything requiring specialized knowledge to operate. Water purification systems, electrical generation beyond the building's backup, defensive systems. We're rich and incompetent, I said. Kulquit didn't argue the point. I'm rich and communications competent. You're rich and relay competent. Between us, we can talk to the entire world and listen to the entire spectrum. What we can't do is drive a fuel truck, operate a water treatment plant, or defend 9 miles of perimeter. So, the gate stays open. The gate stays open until someone drives through it who knows how to do something we can't. The first person who came through Gate 7 was not someone we invited. 40 hours after I'd arrived, while Kulquit and I were running cable between the communications building and the nearest warehouse to extend our operational footprint to a second structure. A white pickup truck with a Texas Parks and Wildlife decal rolled through the open gate at walking speed and stopped in the middle of the road. The driver was a man in his 50s named Hector, and he hadn't heard any signal. He'd been a state game warden working the backcountry west of Killeen when things went wrong, and he'd come to the base because it was the largest fenced area on his mental map. He'd driven the fence line for an hour, looking for a way in, and found the open gate. His truck bed contained a bolt-action rifle, a cooler of venison, and a German shepherd named Ruthie, who growled at both of us with uniform suspicion. Hector's value became apparent within 20 minutes. He knew water, not theoretically, physically. His district had maintained wildlife watering stations across 2,000 square miles of drought-prone rangeland, and he'd rebuilt and improvised water systems in field conditions for decades. When Kulquit showed him the base's water treatment building on the operations map, he studied it for about 30 seconds and said, "Take me there." The water treatment facility was a quarter-mile south of us. Driving there meant traveling through the base's internal road network in the open, past buildings we hadn't cleared, through an area we couldn't monitor from the communications building's roof. Kulquit Hector got back in his truck and drove there alone, with Ruthie riding shotgun. And we watched from the roof as he disappeared between warehouses and didn't come back for 4 hours. When he returned, he was filthy, calm, and carrying a clipboard. Systems intact. Pressurized municipal supply is dead, but the base has a groundwater well with an electric pump tied to the grid. Grid's down, but the pump can be run off a generator if someone moves one to the well house. Pipe network from the well house to the treatment building is gravity-fed. The well house sits on higher ground. Treatment building has chemical stocks for 6 months. He set the clipboard on Kulquit's console. What it doesn't have is someone to run it. The chemical dosing is manual. Someone has to be there, every day, monitoring and adjusting. Automated systems are all networked to a central control that's down with the grid. 3 people. One handled communications, one handled infrastructure relay, one handled water. We were 3 specialized workers in a plant designed for thousands, and every system we brought online required a body to babysit it. The math was simple and merciless. The base's resources could sustain a large population, but a large population was required to access the resources. Below a certain threshold of people, the base was a landscape of locked potential. Above that threshold, it became functional. The question was where the threshold sat, and what happened during the dangerous period between too few and enough. Kulquit modified the embedded broadcast that evening. The original signal had been designed for communications specialists, a narrow aperture aimed at a specific competency. Now she widened it. The new burst included not just coordinates and a timestamp, but a brief, compressed inventory. Water, fuel, food, shelter, medical supplies, perimeter. She was advertising. Every person who heard the signal and decoded it would know exactly what the base offered. They'd also know, because Kulquit was precise, that the base's operational staff was 3 people and a dog. That's a risk, I said. Everything is a risk. The only thing that isn't a risk is sitting here with full warehouses and empty buildings until the generators run out of fuel. She looked at me with an expression I was learning to recognize, the look of someone who'd already calculated several moves ahead and was waiting for you to catch up. We need electricians, mechanics, medical, anyone who can operate equipment. Every person who comes through that gate with a useful skill brings us closer to the point where this base actually functions. Every day we wait, the pool of people who might be listening gets smaller. And if the wrong people come through, then we deal with that. But the wrong people coming through an open gate is a problem. The right people not coming through because we closed it is a catastrophe. Hector, who'd been listening while feeding Ruthie, looked up. She's right. I didn't hear any signal. I came because the gate was open. Close the gate. I'm still out there driving the fence line. The gate stayed open. Kulquit broadcast, and we waited for the math to shift. The math shifted on the 4th day, violently. Not because of who arrived, but because of what followed them. By morning of day 4, we had 9 people. After Hector, they'd come in 1s and 2s, a married couple who'd been Army Logistics NCOs at the base before the evacuation. And it turned around when the convoy stalled. A young woman named Priya, who'd been an electrical apprentice at a construction site in Killeen, and had spent 3 days hiding in a gas station before hearing Kulquit's signal on a battery-powered emergency radio her father had given her. A retired veterinarian named Dale, who'd driven from Lampasas with his truck packed with animal antibiotics that, he correctly noted, were chemically identical to several human formulations. Each arrival expanded what we could operate. The logistics couple, Reese and Tomoko Hamada, knew the base like a body they'd lived inside. They mapped every warehouse, every fuel point, every access road from memory. Priya got the 2nd generator online and began restoring electrical service to buildings Kulquit designated as priorities. Dale established a medical station in a maintenance bay and started organizing pharmaceutical supplies. 9 people, 9 specialties. A base designed for tens of thousands. We were a skeleton crew in the most literal sense. The bones of an operation with no muscle, no fat, no redundancy. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Priya radioed from the electrical substation where she'd been working to restore grid segments. Her voice was controlled in a way that told me the control was costing her. I need someone on the roof. South side. Now. Kulquit and I went up. From the south parapet, we could see past the warehouse rows to the perimeter fence, a mile away, running straight and clean along the base's southern boundary. Beyond the fence, the terrain dropped into a shallow draw that fed into a seasonal creek. The draw was full. Not with water, with people. Hundreds of them, moving in the same southeast heading Kulquit had described. But this group was different in 2 ways I could see even from a mile's distance. First, it was larger. Not several hundred, but several thousand. A mass that extended back along the draw beyond what I could see. Still emerging from the northwest. Second, its front edge had reached the fence and stopped. They weren't climbing. They weren't pushing. They were standing at the chain link, pressed against it. And the ones behind them were pressing against them. And the pressure was building the way water builds behind a dam. Not through intention, but through accumulation. The fence was designed to stop individual humans from crossing. It was not designed to resist the hydraulic pressure of thousands of bodies compressed against it by the weight of thousands more behind them. How long? I asked Kulquit. She was already on her radio, calling everyone back to the communications building. Depends on the post spacing and the footer depth. If it's standard installation, and I don't know that it is. Hours. If the posts are corroded or the concrete is cracked, less. Reese Hamada's voice came over the radio, steady as a metronome. I've seen that section of fence from the maintenance side. The posts are 30-year-old galvanized steel. Some of them have rust at the base. I wouldn't bet on ours. This was the moment the base stopped being an inventory problem and became a spatial one. We had 9 miles of fence. We had 9 people. We had a mass of infected pressing against one section with the patient, mindless aggregate force of a geological event. And we had, somewhere out there, more people who might be listening to Kulquit's signal, people we needed, people who would come through the open west gate, the gate that was now on the opposite side of the base from a failing barrier. Options, Kulquit said. And I heard in her voice not panic, but the particular urgency of a person whose plan has just encountered a variable the plan didn't account for. Hector spoke first. We don't fight that. We can't fight that. We redirect it. How? Same way you redirect cattle. You don't push back. You give them somewhere to go. Hector's idea was simple in concept and enormous in execution. The infected were pressing south against the fence because they were following a southeast heading, and the fence was in their way. If we opened a section of the fence ahead of their direction of travel, east of where they were pressing, the pressure against the current contact point would relieve as the mass found a path that aligned with whatever was pulling them southeast. We wouldn't be fighting the current. We'd be giving it a channel. The problem was reaching the east fence section to open it. The base's internal road network ran east-west in a grid, and driving east meant driving parallel to the south fence, within visual and audible range of the mass pressing against it. We didn't know what attracted them beyond their general heading. We didn't know if engine noise would redirect any part of the group toward us. We had no data on their responsiveness to sound at this density. Everything Kulquit had observed so far involved smaller groups in open terrain, not a compressed mass at a barrier. Tomoko Hamada solved the problem by knowing something none of us knew. There's a service tunnel, she said, pulling a maintenance map from the base operations binder she'd assembled on day 2. Runs from the power substation near the motor pool to the south gate control booth. It's a utility conduit. Electrical and communications cabling, about 4 feet in diameter. It's not designed for people, but I've crawled through it during maintenance outages. How far? 1,100 meters. And it comes out where? Inside the south gate booth, which is about 300 meters west of where the fence meets the east perimeter. 300 meters above ground. From the booth to the east fence, inside of whatever was pressing against the south barrier. But the tunnel would get us most of the way, without exposure. It was the best option we had, and we were running out of time to find a better one. From the roof, I could see the south fence visibly bowing inward at the point of maximum pressure. The posts were leaning. The chain link was stretching, deforming from diamond shapes into elongated parallelograms that meant the metal was approaching its yield point. Hector and Reese would go through the tunnel. Hector because he'd proposed the plan, and because he was the most physically capable among us. Reese because he knew the east fence infrastructure and could identify the fastest way to open a section. The rest of us would monitor from the communications building and the roof, relaying information about the mass's movement. I gave them my FEMA radio, which operated on a frequency the base's military handhelds could also receive. Kulquit gave them wire cutters, bolt cutters, and a pry bar from the communications building's maintenance locker. Tomoko drew them a diagram of the tunnel, marking every junction box and cable tray that would narrow the passage. Dale gave Hector a flashlight and a blunt assessment. If someone gets hurt in that tunnel, I can't get to you. Don't get hurt. They entered the tunnel at 3:40 p.m. Priya, from the substation roof where she had direct line of sight to the south fence, gave us the first real-time description of what was happening at the barrier. The mass is about 30 meters deep at the widest point. The ones at the front are being crushed against the fence. Some of them aren't moving anymore, but they're being held upright by the pressure behind them. The ones at the back are still walking forward. They're not reacting to the ones in front being compressed. It's like each one of them can only see the one directly ahead and just follows. Any indication they're aware of the base, the buildings, the vehicles? None. They're not looking at all. They're just heading southeast and the fence is in the way. Hector's voice came through the radio, breathless and echoing. We're at the first junction. Tunnels tighter than the map shows. Cable trays are sagging from the ceiling. We're moving, but it's slow. On the roof, Kulquit stood with binoculars fixed on the south fence, counting. I watched her lips move as she tallied. After 2 minutes, she lowered the binoculars. The fence posts are spaced 10 feet apart. I can see 14 posts in the deformation zone. That's 140 feet of fence taking the pressure. If one post fails, the load transfers to the adjacent posts, which accelerates their failure. It'll go in a cascade. How long? I'm not an engineer, Dara. Best guess. Before dark. Dark was 4 hours away. Hector and Reese were in a tunnel that would take at least 30 minutes to traverse. Then 300 meters of open ground. Then however long it took to breach a section of fence that was built to military specification. We needed 3 hours. We might have 4. The margin was so thin, I could feel it in my chest, like in a physical compression. Hector reached the south gate booth at 4:22 p.m. Reese was 90 seconds behind him, having gotten wedged at a cable junction where a collapsed tray had reduced the tunnel to a space he'd navigated by dislocating his shoulder. Deliberately, with Hector pulling from ahead, a detail he reported over the radio with the flat affect of someone describing a stuck drawer. Tomoko heard it and went completely still at her console. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. From the booth, Hector described what he saw at ground level. The south fence 300 meters to his left, bowing inward. The dead and the pressing alive merged into a single mass of compressed bodies. The sound, he said, was what got him. Not moaning, not screaming, but the creak of metal and the wet, dense sound of bodies under pressure, like a bag of something organic being slowly stepped on. The east fence was ahead of him, running perpendicular to the south barrier, and he could see the intersection where the two fence lines met at a 90-degree corner reinforced with a concrete anchor post. If I cut the east fence near the corner, Hector radioed, the mass should flow through the gap as it rounds the corner, like cutting the bank on a river bend. The current does the work. Reese, whose right arm was now functionally useless, talked Hector through the fence construction. Standard chain link, but the military spec uses heavier gauge wire and the bottom rail is buried in a concrete footer. You won't cut through the footer with bolt cutters. Focus on the chain link. Cut a vertical line from top rail to bottom rail, then pull the cut section back like a curtain. The tension in the fabric will want to spring it back, so you'll need to anchor it to what? The gate booth. Drive the truck to the gap and tie the fence section to the bumper. This required Hector to go back to the booth, get the truck that was parked there. A standard military utility vehicle, which Reese confirmed should have keys in the ignition per base policy, and drive it to their fence line. Engine noise, movement. 300 meters from the largest concentration of infected we'd observed. Priya's voice from the substation. The south fence is going to fail before dark. I can see daylight under 2 of the posts. The concrete footers are lifting. There was no more time for deliberation. Kulquit, beside me on the roof, keyed her radio and said something I've thought about every day since. Hector, the fence is a clock, and you're the only hand on it. Go. He went. From the roof, a mile away, I watched through binoculars as a small green vehicle emerged from the gate booth area and drove east along the interior perimeter road, trailing dust. It reached a point near the corner where the south and east fences met, and a figure got out and began working at the fence with a tool I couldn't see. Reese was somewhere behind him, unable to cut but able to direct, talking steadily on the radio, guiding Hector's cuts with the precision of someone who'd maintained this infrastructure for years and knew every wire gauge and fastener type by feel. The cutting took 40 minutes. 40 minutes during which the south fence continued to deform, the posts continued to lean, and the mass continued to accumulate. Kulquit counted. Priya counted. I counted. We were all counting different things. Kulquit the structural indicators, Priya the depth of the mass, me the time. And none of our counts were reassuring. At 5:14 p.m., Hector radioed. Cut is complete. Section is pulled back and tied to the bumper. Gap is about 12 feet wide. I'm moving back to the booth. What's happening at the gap? Kulquit asked. Silence. Then, nothing yet. They haven't found it. This was the flaw in the plan, and we all recognized it simultaneously. The mass was pressing south because the south fence was in their path. The east fence gap was around a corner, 300 meters from the point of maximum pressure. The infected at the front of the mass couldn't move. They were pinned against the barrier by the weight behind them. The infected at the back were still pushing forward. For the gap to work, the mass had to expand laterally along the fence until its eastern edge discovered the opening. That required time we might not have. Hector, back at the booth, watching from 60 meters away, said, I have an idea. You're going to hate it. Say it. I go to the gap. I make noise. I pull the eastern edge toward me. Then I go through the gap ahead of them and circle back to the booth from outside the fence. Kulquit closed her eyes. Open them. You'd be outside the perimeter. For about 2 minutes, my truck is at the gap. I drive through, circle the outside of the fence, come back in through gate 7 on the west side. That's a 3-mile drive outside the perimeter, on open ground, in a vehicle, with nothing between me and the gate but grass. The mass is at the south fence. The west side is clear. It's a 3-minute drive. Reese's voice tight with pain. Let him go. Tomoko's voice tighter. Reese, let him go. The fence won't hold. Hector drove to the gap at 5:31 p.m. From the communications building roof, I watched the green dot of his vehicle stop near the corner. A figure got out. And then, through the binoculars, I saw him do something I couldn't immediately parse. He was banging the pry bar against the truck's hood, rhythmically. A metallic ringing that carried across the distance as a faint, rapid pinging. Priya, from the substation, the eastern edge of it, the mass is shifting. They're turning. Oh God, they're all turning. Not all, but enough. The mass was a fluid body, and Hector's sound was a new current at its edge. The infected nearest the corner began peeling away from the south fence, moving east along the barrier toward the sound. As they moved, the pressure on the south fence didn't decrease. The mass behind them simply filled the space they'd vacated, maintaining the forward push, but the eastern edge was flowing now. Rounding the corner, finding the gap. They're at the gap, Hector reported, and I could hear the pry bar still ringing behind his voice. First ones are going through. Yeah, they're going through. They're just walking through like it's not even there. The gap became a channel. The infected flowed through it with the mindless certainty of water finding a drain. And as the flow established itself, more of the mass redirected toward it. The pressure on the south fence began. Slowly, agonizingly, slowly. To ease, posts that had been leaning at 30 degrees settled back to 20. The chain link, stretched beyond its original shape, held. Hector, get in the truck, Kulquit said. Not yet. The flow isn't established enough. If I stop the sound, Hector, get in the truck. 30 more seconds. I counted those seconds. I counted them with my binoculars fixed on a 56-year-old game warden standing next to a gap in a fence while a river of infected bodies flowed past him 4 meters away, drawn by the sound of metal on metal, indifferent to his living presence because the sound was louder than his biology. At second 23, one of them turned its head toward him. I saw it through the binoculars. A lateral rotation of the head, not toward the sound, but toward the Hector himself, a specific and focused attention that the others weren't displaying. Hector, one of them is looking at you. Move now. He dropped the pry bar, got in the truck, and drove through the gap into the open field beyond the fence. The figure that had turned toward him took a step in his direction, then 2, and then the flow of the mass carried it forward through the gap and southeast, away from the truck, away from the base, away from everything, except whatever invisible attractor was pulling them all in the same direction. Hector's truck circled wide through the scrubland, headlights on now as the sun dropped, and 11 minutes later came through Gate 7 trailing a cloud of caliche dust. Ruthie barked once from the communications building doorway, and Hector pulled up, got out, and sat down on the ground next to his dog, with his back against the tire and his hands shaking in a way I could see from 30 feet away. The south fence held. The flow through the east gap continued through the night, diminishing gradually as the mass passed through. By morning, the field beyond the east fence was empty, and a 12-foot gap in our perimeter stood open to the world. That gap changed everything, not because it was a vulnerability, though it was, but because of what it proved. The base wasn't a fortress. It couldn't be a fortress. 9 miles of fence with 9 people was a fiction of security, and the infected had demonstrated that any section could fail under sufficient pressure at any time. What the base actually was, what Kulquit had understood from the beginning, and what the rest of us learned that evening, was a logistics platform. It had value not because of its walls, but because of its contents, its communications, its position. The fence was a convenience, not a guarantee. The gate was open because it had to be. And the gap in the east fence would stay open too, because closing it meant pretending the fence was something it had never been. 9 people sat in the communications building that night, eating MREs under fluorescent light. And nobody talked about defense. They talked about systems, water flow rates, generator fuel consumption, radio frequency allocation, medical inventory, the language of a working installation, not a besieged one. Kulquit had been right. The signal had been right. The gate had been right. The question had never been how to keep things out. The question was how to keep things running. On day 9, the population was 23, and I stopped being a relay technician. Not by choice, by necessity. The signal had worked. People arrived carrying skills the way refugees carry photographs. The essential thing, the thing that proved who you'd been and might still be. An HVAC contractor from Round Rock who understood pressurized systems at a level that made our water operation 3 times more efficient. 2 nurses from the Temple Hospital who'd walked 18 miles overnight after the hospital fell, carrying a surgical kit between them in a pillowcase. A retired Army major named Constance Oliveira, who'd spent her career in logistics and took one look at our supply operation and said, with the particular weariness of someone watching amateurs replicate work she'd spent 30 years perfecting, "You're going to run out of fuel in 11 days at current consumption." She was right. We'd been running generators the way civilians run generators, on as needed, off when not, with no metering, no load management, no consumption tracking. Oliveira implemented a power schedule within hours, cutting our fuel consumption by 60% through the simple discipline of running fewer generators at higher loads, which is more fuel efficient than running more generators at partial loads. She also identified a buried fuel tank near the motor pool that wasn't on any of our maps, a legacy installation from a previous base configuration, containing an estimated 4,000 gallons of diesel that nobody had inventoried because nobody had looked. I stopped being a relay technician because Kulquit asked me to be something else. The communications network she'd built, the signal, the monitoring, the relay maintenance, was growing beyond what 2 people could manage. Every new arrival brought information, conditions in nearby towns, movement patterns of the infected, locations of other survivor groups, road conditions, bridge status, resource caches. This information was valuable individually but transformative collectively, because each piece modified our understanding of the operating environment. The problem was that nobody was synthesizing it. "I need you to stop maintaining equipment and start maintaining knowledge," Kulquit said. "Every person who comes through that gate carries intelligence. Most of them don't know they're carrying it, because they experienced it as chaos, not data. Your job is to debrief every new arrival, extract the operationally relevant information, and build a picture. A picture of what? Of everything within 100 miles of this base, where the infected are moving, where they're not, where other people are holding, where resources are accessible, where roads are passable. I need you to build me a map that shows not just geography, but status. What's alive? What's dead? What's dangerous? What's useful? I started that afternoon with a roll of butcher paper from the mess hall supplies, a box of markers, and the debriefing notes I'd already taken from every arrival. The map grew on the wall of the communications building's main room, and within 3 days, it covered an area of 200 miles in every direction, annotated with information from 31 sources. Our 23 residents and 8 radio contacts Kulquit had established with other survivor groups. The pattern that emerged was not what I expected. I'd assumed the infected were everywhere. A uniform threat saturating the landscape. The map showed something different. They moved in streams, dense directional flows along specific corridors, mostly following terrain features like creek beds, river valleys, and highway medians. Between the streams, there were dead zones where no one had reported infected activity at all. These dead zones weren't small. Some of them were 15, 20 miles across. They were habitable. They were connected, in some cases, by routes that threaded between the streams like paths through a forest. The base sat in one of these dead zones. That was why Kulquit's gate had worked, why people had been able to drive in from multiple directions, why the mass at the south fence had been a transit event rather than a siege. We weren't being surrounded. We were in the eye of a pattern, and the pattern had structure. I showed the map to Oliveira, because Oliveira thought in systems, and I needed someone to confirm or destroy what I was seeing. She studied it for a long time, tracing the streams with her finger, noting the dead zones, cross-referencing with terrain maps from the base's planning office. "It's drainage," she said finally. "They're following drainage. Look, every stream you've marked corresponds to a watershed. Creeks, rivers, arroyos, even highway drainage ditches. They're going downhill. Not quickly, not steeply, but consistently. They're flowing the same direction as water." I don't know why, but if it's true, then every ridgeline is a boundary. The base is on a subtle ridge between 2 drainage systems. That's why it's in a dead zone. A ridgeline, not a fence, not a wall. The thing that was actually keeping us safe was a feature of the terrain so subtle that nobody had noticed it. A gentle rise in the land that divided 2 watersheds, and thus divided 2 streams of infected migration. Our fence was irrelevant. Our location was everything. The watershed theory changed the nature of the base, from a defensive position to something none of us had a word for. Kulquit tried byte to node. Oliveira preferred exchange. Hector characteristically called it the high ground, and left it at that. What it meant in practice was that our value wasn't in what we had, though we had plenty, but in where we sat. We were on a ridge between 2 rivers of death, and from that ridge, we could see, communicate with, and potentially reach other dead zones where other people were surviving. I expanded the map. Radio contacts multiplied as Kulquit's signal propagated through the relay network. A group in Lampasas, a church congregation in Gatesville, a ranch family near Goldthwaite who'd been running their own small community for 2 weeks without outside contact. Each contact added data. Each data point refined the map. The streams became clearer, the dead zones better defined, and the routes between them. The ridgeline paths that threaded between watersheds began to look less like gaps and more like a network. On a day 14, I drew those routes on the map in green, and the room went quiet, because what I'd drawn, connecting dead zones along ridgelines, looked like a road map, not the road map we'd had before. Highways and interstates that followed valleys and river corridors, which were now the most dangerous terrain on the continent. But a new one, a network of safe passages that connected surviving communities through the spaces the infected weren't using. Priya, who'd been standing behind me, said what everyone was thinking. We could reach them. Not in theory, in practice. The routes existed. We had vehicles, we had fuel, we had communications. What we didn't have, what nobody had, was confirmation that the theory worked, that you could actually drive a ridgeline between 2 streams of infected and arrive alive at the other end. Hector volunteered before anyone asked. Of course he did. He'd been the one to drive outside the fence, the one who understood that barriers were less important than motion, the one whose professional life had been spent moving through wild territory by reading the land rather than the map. Ruthie would go with him. He'd take a 2-day supply, a radio, and the route I'd drawn to the Lampasas group, 40 miles southwest, along a ridgeline that my data suggested was clear. Kulquit authorized it. Not because she had authority. We'd never formalized authority, and the absence of hierarchy was becoming both a strength and a problem. But because the communications network was hers, and she understood that a network of voices without physical connection was just an audience. To become a system, the nodes had to touch. Hector left at dawn on day 15. His radio check-ins came every 30 minutes, brief and observational. Terrain clear, road passable, no visual contact. He reported passing through 2 small towns that were empty. Not destroyed, just vacant. Populations either evacuated or migrated. He reported crossing a highway that ran along a creek bed and seeing, from the overpass, a stream of infected moving through the creek corridor below him. Hundreds of them, flowing southeast, oblivious to his vehicle 80 feet above. He reached Lampasas at noon. The group there, 14 people anchored to a county courthouse, had food but no communications, no fuel, and no medical supplies. Hector gave them a radio, showed them the frequency, and promised that a supply run would follow if the route proved repeatable. Route is solid, he radioed that evening. Ridgeline holds. Streams are exactly where Dara's map says they are. I could see them from high points. Lines of movement in the valleys. Ridgeline was empty the whole way. It works. 2 words that transformed us from a base into a hub. Because if one route worked, others could work. And if routes worked, then the isolated communities dotting our map, the ranch families, the church congregations, the hospital holdouts, the accidental survivors clustered in dead zones they didn't know were dead zones, could be reached, supplied, informed, and connected. Oliveira organized the first supply convoy 3 days later. 2 vehicles, 4 people, carrying MREs, medical kits, radio equipment, water purification tablets, and copies of the map. They followed a different ridgeline north toward Gatesville. They arrived, delivered, established a relay station, and returned. The second convoy went west. The third went northeast. Each one confirmed the theory, refined the routes, and expanded the network. The base was consuming itself to feed others. Every MRE we sent out was one we didn't eat. Every gallon of fuel that powered a convoy was one that didn't power our generators. Oliveira tracked the burn rate with the grim precision of an accountant watching a balance sheet tilt towards 0. At current distribution rates, she told me on day 20, we're viable for 90 days. After that, we've given away more than we can sustain on. And if we stop giving, we're viable for a year, maybe more. But the network collapses. The network collapses. This wasn't a moral dilemma. I want to be specific about that, because it's tempting to frame it as one. The generous choice versus the selfish one. The hard right versus the easy wrong. It was a mathematical question about whether the network would return more than it consumed before the base's reserves were exhausted. If the connected communities could produce, grow food, find fuel, manufacture necessities, and if those products could flow back along the ridgeline routes, then the base's investment would generate returns. If they couldn't, or if the routes failed, or if the streams shifted and cut the network, then we'd have given away our survival for nothing. I didn't know the answer. Neither did Oliveira. Neither did Kulquit. The difference between us was that Kulquit had already committed to the network before the question was fully formed, and Oliveira wanted the question answered before committing further. And I was the person holding the map that both of them needed to make their case. The return started small. A truck from Lampasas on day 24 carrying deer meat. Hector had taught them where to hunt along the ridgeline corridor, where game was concentrated in the dead zones. A handcart from a farm family 7 miles north, pushed along a dirt track by 2 teenagers, carrying 40 pounds of sweet potatoes and a note that read, "More in 3 weeks if the plants hold." Then less small. The Gatesville relay station, staffed by a former county emergency manager named Booth, began coordinating between 3 communities in its own area, pooling resources before sending them south to us. Booth had the organizational instinct of a woman who'd spent 20 years managing tornado responses, and she applied it with ferocious efficiency. Her first consolidated shipment arrived on day 28. Fuel in jerry cans siphoned from agricultural equipment, canned goods from a restaurant supply warehouse. Her team had access through a ridgeline route and, critically, 16 car batteries that Priya needed to build a distributed power storage system that would reduce our generator dependence. Oliveira updated her projections. The balance sheet was still tilting toward depletion, but the rate of tilt was slowing. Incoming resources were beginning to register. Not enough, not yet. But the curve was bending. The network's first crisis came on day 30. And it didn't come from the infected. It came from Hector. He'd been running the Lampasas route every 4 days, a rhythm that had become the network's pulse. Regular, reliable, essential. On his 5th run, he radioed from the midpoint to report that the ridgeline road had been blocked, not by infected, by people. A group of 11, armed, had positioned vehicles across the road and were charging passage in fuel and food. Hector had enough of both to pay. But paying meant legitimizing the blockade. And a legitimized blockade on the only route to Lampasas would strangle the connection. "I can go around," Hector said. "There's a ranch road that drops off the ridgeline and rejoins it 2 miles south. But it passes through lower ground. Could be in a stream corridor." "Don't," I said immediately, staring at my map. The ranch road he was describing crossed a contour line that my data couldn't resolve. It might be ridgeline. It might be drainage. The margin was a few dozen feet of elevation, and a few dozen feet was the difference between a dead zone and a death sentence. "Then I pay. If you pay, they own the route." Kulquit cut in. "Hector, hold position. I'm going to talk to them." What followed was an hour of radio communication that I listened to from the communications building while Hector sat in his truck 100 meters from the blockade. Kulquit didn't threaten. She didn't negotiate. She informed. She told the blockade group exactly what the network was, where the streams were, why the ridgeline was safe, and what would happen to their position, which sat in a dead zone that was only viable because of its elevation. If they disrupted the supply routes that connected the dead zones into a functioning system. She told them about the returning convoys, the food from Lampasas, the fuel from Gatesville, the batteries that kept the lights on. She told them they were welcome to join the network, receive supplies, contribute what they could, and use the communication system to connect with anyone they were trying to reach. She did not tell them that the base had weapons, because the base did have weapons. The armory had been locked, but Reese had accessed it on day 6. And we'd made a deliberate decision not to use that fact as leverage, not out of principle. Out of Oliveira's calculation that an armed reputation would attract armed challenges, and we didn't have the population to survive an armed confrontation. The network's strength was its utility, not its capacity for violence. The blockade group listened. 3 of them came to the base the next day. 2 stayed. The 3rd went back to bring the rest. The route reopened, but the incident revealed a vulnerability that my map couldn't show. The network depended on routes that could be physically controlled by anyone willing to sit on them. The ridgelines that kept us safe from the infected also funneled all human traffic into narrow corridors that a handful of people with vehicles could choke. We'd solved the problem of the infected by reading the terrain. Now the terrain was creating a new problem, one that involved living people making choices we couldn't predict or redirect by cutting a gap in a fence. On day 41, I walked out of the communications building at 3 a.m. because I couldn't sleep, and the map was pulling me the way it had been pulling me for weeks. Not to look at it, but to stand in front of it and feel the disparity between what it showed and what it couldn't. The map now covered an entire wall and part of the ceiling, extending into areas we'd confirmed through radio contact as far as the Oklahoma border to the north, the Colorado River to the south, and the cross timbers to the east. 53 communities were marked on it. 31 active ridgeline routes connected them. The network had a name now. People were calling it the Ridge, casually, the way you name a thing that's become too large to describe every time you reference it. 7 relay stations operated between the base and the outermost nodes. Supply moved in both directions. Information moved constantly. Booth's Gatesville hub had become a secondary coordination center, handling its own sub-network of 12 communities without routing every decision through us. The base population was 44, not because people had flooded in, though they'd come, but because people had also left. The logistics NCOs had gone to establish a hub in Waco. Dale had moved to the Gatesville Medical Station where he was needed more. Priya was splitting her time between the base and a solar installation project at a farm community 30 miles north. People flowed through the base the way information flowed through the network, arriving, integrating, contributing, and in many cases, moving to where their skills produced greater effect. The base was not accumulating population. It was processing it. This was not what I'd imagined when I drove through Gate 7 6 weeks ago. I'd imagined, to the extent that I'd imagined anything beyond the next relay diagnostic, that survival meant finding a place and holding it. The base, with its fences and warehouses and motor pools, had seemed like the ultimate version of that idea. A stronghold. The word was even in my vocabulary, inherited from every survival story I'd absorbed without examining. You find the stronghold, you fortify it, you hold. But we hadn't held. We'd distributed. The base's resources had left the base. The base's people had left the base. The base's knowledge had left the base. What remained was the communications infrastructure and the map. The two things that couldn't be moved because their value depended on their position, on sitting at the top of the ridge where they could see and talk to everything below. Kulquit found me staring at the map. She did that sometimes. Appeared at odd hours, operating on a schedule that bore no relationship to day or night. She'd lost weight. We all had. The returning supply convoys brought enough to sustain us, but not enough to sustain us comfortably. And the difference between survival and comfort was, it turned out, measurable in the looseness of your belt and the sharpness of your cheekbones. "What are you looking at?" she asked. The spaces between the roots. She stood beside me. The roots were green lines connecting blue dots. Between them, the map was annotated with red. The streams, the drainage corridors, the rivers of infected flowing perpetually southeast through terrain that would never be habitable as long as the flow continued. "The red space is getting wider," I said. I'd been tracking it for 2 weeks, and the trend was unmistakable. The streams weren't static. They were braiding, splitting, finding new drainage channels, filling corridors that had been empty a month ago. 2 routes that had been safe on day 20 were now marginal. One had been abandoned entirely after a convoy reported infected in a valley that my map had shown as clear. "The dead zones are shrinking," Kulquit said. Not a question. Slowly, but consistently. The ridge between 2 streams that was 5 miles wide on day 10 is 3 miles wide now. The stream corridors are expanding laterally, probably because the volume of infected in them is increasing. More bodies, more spread. Does the network still function? Today, yes. In 30 days, at current rates of expansion, we lose 4 routes and 7 communities become unreachable. She absorbed this. Kulquit had a way of receiving bad information that made you feel like you'd handed her a tool rather than a wound. She didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't offer false optimism. She processed. "What does the map say we should do?" The map said. And I'd been staring at it for an hour because I didn't want to say this out loud. That the base's position was not permanent. The ridge we sat on was high enough to remain clear for months, possibly longer. But the communities we'd connected were on lower, narrower ridges that the expanding streams would eventually submerge. The network would contract. The outermost nodes would go dark first, then the mid-range relays, then the nearby communities, like lights going out from the edge of a grid toward the center, unless the center moved. I presented the projection to the full base population the next morning, standing in front of the map with a marker in my hand and a feeling in my stomach like the ground was tilting. 44 people in a room designed for military briefings, sitting in chairs that still had unit designation stickers on the backs. Kulquit sat in the front row. Oliveira sat in the back. Hector leaned against the wall near the door with Ruthie at his feet. The math was straightforward. I showed the stream expansion data. I showed the route degradation timeline. I showed the 30-day and 60-day projections of network contraction. And then I showed the alternative. Not an answer, but a direction. The streams are flowing southeast. They're expanding laterally, but they're also advancing. The leading edge of the streams is moving deeper into the drainage basins toward the Gulf. Behind the leading edge, northwest of us, the streams are thinner. The areas that were dense with infected 2 weeks ago are less dense now. Not empty, but thinning. The population is migrating. Reese Hamada, his right arm still weak from the tunnel injury, spoke first. You're saying the safe ground is behind us, northwest? I'm saying the safe ground is moving, and it's moving northwest as the streams drain southeast. If we stay here, the network contracts around us until we're the last node. If we move the network's center northwest, following the thinning, we can maintain or expand the connections. Silence, the kind of silence that meant everyone was recalculating everything they'd assumed. Oliveira broke it. Move the center how? This base has fixed infrastructure. Generators, water treatment, communications hardpoints, warehouses. You can't put a motor pool on a truck. No. But you can put a relay station on a truck. And a medical kit, and a map. And the knowledge of how to read the terrain. I looked at the map. The base was never the network. The base was where the network started. The network is the routes, the relays, the communities. If we move the coordination function northwest, establish a new hub on higher ground that the expanding streams won't reach, and leave the base as a supply cache for whoever can still access it, the network continues. You're proposing we abandon the base, Hector said from the wall. I'm proposing we stop pretending the base is what's keeping us alive. The communications are keeping us alive. The map is keeping us alive. The routes are keeping us alive. The base is a building. Buildings don't move. We do. The argument lasted 3 days. It was not the clean, binary debate I'd expected. Stay versus go. It was a granular, exhausting, section-by-section negotiation about what could move and what couldn't, who would go and who would stay, how to maintain supply access during transition, how to communicate the shift to 53 connected communities without triggering panic or abandonment. Kulquit was quiet through most of it. She listened. She asked clarifying questions. She let Oliveira and Reese and Priya and the nurses and the HVAC contractor and every other person in the room have their piece of the argument. On the third evening, she came to the communications building where I was updating the map with the latest stream data. And she said, "The signal I built, the one that brought you here, it was designed for this building, this antenna array, this power supply, this console. If we leave, I have to rebuild it from components, and it won't be as strong. I know. The new signal might not reach as far. Some of the outer communities might lose contact. I know. And the people who are still out there, the ones who haven't found us yet, who are driving fence lines looking for an open gate, they'll come here and find a building instead of a network, unless we leave the gate open and a sign that tells them where we went." She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile, and it changed her face in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not softening it, but revealing a dimension that had been there all along, hidden behind the operational composure. A sign on a military base in central Texas, pointing northwest with a frequency and a map. And an open gate. The convoy departed on day 47. 18 vehicles, 31 people. The remaining 13 stayed at the base to maintain the supply cache and relay communications until the new hub was established and they could follow. Kulquit rode in the lead vehicle with her console components packed in waterproof cases. Oliveira rode in the last vehicle with a complete inventory of everything we'd left behind and a timeline for retrieval. I rode in the middle, in the FEMA truck I'd arrived in, with a map rolled up on the passenger seat and a new roll of butcher paper in the bow, because the map I'd built was already obsolete and the next one would need to cover different ground. We drove northwest along a ridgeline I'd mapped but never traveled, into territory that my data said was thinning, through a landscape that looked like every other piece of central Texas scrubland I'd spent 6 years driving through. Unremarkable, sun-blasted, familiar. Somewhere below us, in the valleys on either side, the streams flowed southeast, carrying their cargo toward the Gulf. Above them, on the spine of land between watersheds, 18 vehicles moved in a line toward a piece of high ground that existed on my map as a blue circle with a question mark inside it. The gate behind us was open. It would stay open. That was the last order nobody gave, because by then, nobody needed to. The new hub was an agricultural co-op building on a mesa outside of San Angelo, chosen because the elevation was right and the antenna height was sufficient, and the building had a commercial kitchen that could feed 60 people. It was not a base. It was not a stronghold. It was a point on a map that would be replaced by another point when the streams shifted again and the ground beneath us became untenable. I mounted the map on the co-op's wall on the first night, and in the morning, I took it down and drew a new one. The old map showed where things had been. The new one needed to show where things were going. Not just the streams, but the thinning behind them. The high ground emerging from the receding flow. The communities that were now out of reach and might become reachable again if the drainage continued. Kulquit's rebuilt signal went live on day 2. Weaker, rougher, but broadcasting. The first response came from a community we'd never contacted. A group in Abilene who'd been listening for weeks, hearing fragments of our network traffic, waiting for a signal clear enough to answer. The gate was always the point. Not the fence, not the base, not the warehouses full of someone else's provisions. The gate. Open, marked, and leading somewhere that moves.